Recently had a great conversation with my good friend Sean Lazar, and I want to share that interview with you right after this. www.freegrace.in. So Sean Lazar and I work with Free Grace International, and we had this plan to do a podcast recently where we were going to talk about the nature of godly friendship, and then we totally didn't do that. We wandered all over the place and talked about just whatever was interesting to me or him, and I want to share a little snippet of that conversation with you. Now, just so you know, you can get the full conversation on the Free Grace International podcast or by going to freegrace.in and searching for that. Okay, let's go right to this, I think, interesting discussion between myself and Sean Lazar. The rapture, as it's taught today, is a kind of a, it's in Scripture, but it's a later interpretation as it is taught today. Do you happen to know offhand when the rapture began to be taught?
Yeah, well, it really took off with John Nelson Darby, who was one of the first guys in the Plymouth Brethren movement. I do believe he was the most influential in making it popular, and then that caught on with the Bible Conference movement, and then was super popularized in the Scofield Study Bible. And so you're right. I mean, rapture theology kind of developed in the mid 1800s. When Israel became a state, that's when it really took off.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
That's when it really took off. But then in the 80s, it all blew apart because all of these guys started saying the rapture is going to happen by 1988 because Israel was a nation in 1948 and a generation is 40 years. So all these signs are going to take place before this generation passes away. And so this has to happen by 1988. And of course, that nothing happened. So people just stopped believing it. Unfortunately, people set dates, and then it put the theology in disrepute.
Yeah, there's a real danger in setting dates. You know, I was reading about a famous theologian, Charles Taz Russell. Are you familiar with him?
Jehovah's Witnesses.
Yeah.
He
Charles
started
Taz
the
Russell.
Jehovah's Witnesses.
He and his the guy that followed him, which was a guy named Judge Rutherford, they were into predictions, and what's interesting is they went hard into some pretty mainline predictions that were part of their central theology, and they still have to wrestle with them today. It took them probably 60 years to sort of distance themselves from those predictions. In fact, I should have brought them in here. I didn't know we'd talk about it, but I've got these two books that I've ordered off of eBay that are from the 1908 and maybe 1921, which have in print these predictions that say the year that is the end of this era and, whatever. And and it damaged it just was such a damaging... it's dangerous. We don't need to be making specific...
Well, absolutely, I think if I'm remembering correctly for them, they made some predictions about the First World War and Jesus coming back during that time. And they said this is like the tribulation period. And then when it didn't happen, they had to account for that to show that they weren't false prophets. And so I think they have Jesus in a spiritual coming during the 1914s, I think, is their official doctrine.
He came in spiritual form. What was he doing before 1914? Right. I don't know, but there's other bigger problems really with them. I mean, they don't believe that Jesus is God. They, there's a whole slew of problems. But that's one of them. I mean, it's definitely one of them is making these wild predictions, and then rather than just saying we were wrong, which would be the right thing to do, they, the nature of the criminal who started it, the guy that. The Charles Taz Russell was just a liar and a criminal. You can quote me on that.
Oh,
but
was he really?
You would. Oh, yeah. He was just. There's some really great court records of him lying under oath, and the judge just basically twisting his arm to make him admit that what he... let me give you an example. So he had a scheme where he sold miracle wheat and he promised that this miracle wheat would yield like 5 times as much as any normal wheat. Well,
oh man,
he made a huge mistake, because that is an empirical promise. I mean, you can go and measure that,
Yeah.
And so there were things like that. He was a con artist up and down. There's another set of court records where he had claimed that he knew Greek and Hebrew and was an expert in the Bible. It was a defamation case against someone who had published a pamphlet denouncing him. He took him to court, and the judge forced him, even though it was his case, forced him to admit that this isn't libel because you don't know Greek. And he was saying, no, I do. And so they held up a Greek alphabet and said, well, could you please identify the letters? And he tried to go into this thing where it was like, well, my method is, and like, no, shut up. Can you say the letters or not?
Yeah,
and he just had to admit, no, I don't know Greek.
Oh, wow.
And it was like that, one thing after another. He was such a con artist and a liar. And the only time that they could ever kind of pull the curtain back was when they put him under a magistrate or a judge. And of course, Jehovah's Witnesses are taught that those records are false, and that those are the religionists. We're the religionists, Sean, by the way. That the religionists are making up these stories to defame their leader and stuff like that.
Okay, well, let's go back to this web of belief thing. So let's say you are that person, and you are urging a Jehovah's Witness, go look at the records. Look at this book I just ordered off of eBay. And it has, it has the false prophecies. It shows you what they said. We know that it didn't happen. I mean, it is possible for someone to change their mind. But
absolutely, it happens all the time. Yeah,
it happens all the time. But it'll take what, like,
not information usually, not just information.
Oh, not information. Okay, yeah.
It does. Information is a part of it, but my experience with people of other religions, I grew up with a guy that was Jehovah's Witness. Loved the guy. We were buddies. He let slip though one time when he was really being pressured. We were in a conversation, and he let slip. He said, "What am I going to do? Am I going to leave my family and everybody that loves me?"
Yeah.
And the answer would be, well, if that's what it takes to follow the truth, yeah. But what he was admitting is that his king reason, all these other reasons were pawns, his king reason was the architecture of his social fabric that he was kind of at the center of. And that is really difficult to break down. That, I mean, and you can't do it with insults, because you start insulting somebody's mama, it's not going to go well, and so it's like, it's a very delicate thing. It's why in Scripture I think you see entire households becoming believers, because if you can get the dad, then a lot of times the rest of the family will consider it, at least. They'll at least think about it. And I think it's why some of those powerful verses about how the church ought to be led by men are probably in there, because it is the best way is to get the thought leader in a tribe or a family. You got to win them over. Otherwise, a lot of times people won't consider it. So it turned out that my friend was not the thought leader in his family. I really should have been debating his dad. If I could have won his dad over, that guy probably wouldn't be a Jehovah's Witness today.
Interesting.
I don't know that for sure. That's a possible, I don't know that for sure, but it's way more likely if you can get the thought leader in a family to budge, and that's hard. That's even harder, because they're usually been in it for 35 years, so 50 years,
that's
60
right.
years.
That's right.
A big thanks to Sean for getting together and having that interesting conversation. The entire conversation we had was about an hour long. You can get a hold of that by going to freegrace.in, or you can navigate over to the Free Grace International podcast or any of our platforms like YouTube or Vimeo, and you can hear that whole conversation there. Thanks for watching. I'll be back with you soon.